Hello everyone, I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So, if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. Story 1. The Quiet Steps in the Woods. Hunting in southern Illinois has always been my sanctuary. It's a place that feels as natural to me as breathing. The family property is vast and full of life, with creeks that sing in the spring and trees that whisper in the autumn winds. I've spent countless hours roaming every corner of this land. I've caught every fish worth catching, hunted every legal game, and learned the lay of the woods so well I could navigate it blindfolded. When I say this place is my domain, I mean it. I've felt comfort here in any weather, at any time, armed with any equipment, or sometimes with none at all. But what happened 2 deer seasons ago was unlike anything I've ever experienced. It's still the one memory that makes my heart race when I replay it in my mind. It was early November when I pulled into the farm, long before first light. My clock read 4:40 a.m., and the chill of the season hung heavy in the air. There were still at least 2 hours until sunrise. I gathered my gear in silence, a shotgun and revolver, a sturdy knife at my belt, an elbow light clipped to my jacket, a thermos full of coffee, and a backpack containing supplies to clean a deer if luck came my way. I stepped off the drive and into the embrace of the woods. The stand I favored was less than a mile away, but the hike there was never easy. It required navigating dense second-growth forest, descending a steep hill, crossing a muddy bottomland, and then climbing a ridge that left my lungs burning. Despite my dread of the hike, it was always worth it for the view and the game. As I descended into the bottoms, my boots sloshed through patches of icy muck, and my breath puffed like smoke in the freezing darkness. The flashlight clipped to my chest cast narrow beams ahead, forcing me to pivot and illuminate familiar trees, trying to keep my bearings in the heavy dark. The forest felt different this morning, heavier, more alive. The frost-coated leaves and underbrush crackled loudly underfoot, but as I climbed, I became aware of another sound. Crunching, not mine. Something else moving, mimicking my steps, always staying close, but never revealing itself. I climbed a quarter of the way up the ridge, every nerve alert to the rhythmic crunching that followed me. Whatever it was seemed to maintain the same distance, never closer, never farther. Hoping to catch sight of it at first light, I eased down beside a tree. I clicked off my flashlight and unslung my shotgun, resting it across my knees. The forest was silent now, unnaturally so. The crackle of frost underfoot had ceased entirely. Maybe my spinning flashlight beam earlier had scared it off. I sipped coffee, trying to calm the unease blooming in my chest, but after 15 minutes of silence, I decided to move on. No sooner had I taken a few steps than the crunching resumed. This time, dread edged into my awareness. I froze, flipped off my light, and slid behind a tree. Silence. The forest seemed to be holding its breath. After 2 minutes of frustrated waiting, I resumed walking, and so did my unseen companion. Each time I halted, the other sound lagged just an instant too long before stopping itself, as if something was trying to mimic my pauses, but didn't quite get the timing right. I abandoned my thermos near a tree so I could carry my flashlight in one hand and my revolver in the other. The last 100 feet to my stand, I climbed backward, facing the sound, determined to keep whatever it was in my sightline. Strangely, nothing moved. The crunching had stopped. The woods were oppressively still, and each shadow felt like it might spring to life. I clambered into my tree stand, heart hammering, and lit a cigarette. Then another, and another. 5 in a row, each puff making me feel a little less exposed. I hunted for just an hour in the daylight, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The sunlight should have been comforting, but I couldn't muster my usual calm. When I descended, I didn't dawdle. Even in the bright morning, the woods seemed heavy with unseen eyes. I moved quickly, glancing over my shoulder every few steps until I reached my truck. I haven't told my family about that morning. Sounds too strange, too much like the ramblings of a man letting his imagination get the best of him. And yet, when I think back, the sounds seemed human. Not the padding of a deer, nor the shuffle of a raccoon. Something, or someone, was pacing me in the woods. Poachers and trespassers aren't uncommon in these parts. It's what I tell myself anyway. Still, ever since that day, I make sure someone knows where I'm going and how long I'll be gone. The woods are vast, and sometimes even the most familiar places can feel alien when the light fades. I never saw anything that morning, not a flash of movement, not a glimmer of eyes in the beam of my light. Perhaps that's the strangest part of all. Whatever had stalked me, it was clever enough or cautious enough not to be seen. I still don't know what it was. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was something I wasn't meant to see. But sometimes, late at night, I lie awake and hear the echo of frost crunching under unseen footsteps. And I wonder what might have been just out of sight in those woods. Story 2. The night the aliens came. When I was growing up in the late 90s, aliens were everywhere in the media. Movies and TV shows like Independence Day, The X-Files, Men in Black, and even quirky cartoons like Invader Zim seemed to constantly bring extraterrestrials into my young mind. My family never expressed any particular interest in the subject, but the idea of life beyond Earth just felt like a background hum in my childhood. Stories of abductions and crop circles fascinated me in a detached way. I wasn't afraid of them. They didn't seem real enough to pose any immediate danger. That is, until one night changed how I saw the world forever. I had always been a sleep talker. My parents would sometimes catch me mumbling in the middle of the night, stringing together words they could barely understand. But around the age of 9 or 10, my sleep habits took a strange turn. I started sleepwalking. My parents would often find me standing silently in the hallway or wandering the living room, as though on some invisible mission. Usually, they could gently guide me back to bed without any trouble, and I would wake up in the morning with no memory of these events. But there was one night that didn't follow that pattern. One night that still lingers like a shadow in my memory, even though I can't fully recall it myself. It happened on an ordinary evening. My mom came to check on me before she went to bed, but when she peeked into my room, I wasn't in my bed. Concerned, she scanned the dimly lit space and noticed a small figure crouched in the closet. It was me. When she softly asked what I was doing, I didn't answer. As she approached to guide me back to bed, she said I started crying, soft, pitiful sobs that grew louder as I mumbled incoherently about aliens. And then, to her shock, I urinated on the floor. She called for my dad, her voice laced with confusion and concern. When my father arrived and tried to lift me into his arms, I lashed out violently. My tiny fists struck his face in a way I'd never done before. Both of them were stunned. I had always been a gentle child, and this sudden burst of aggression seemed completely out of character. They had no choice but to let me cry myself out, all the while listening to my repeated pleas. The aliens. Don't let them take me again. Don't let them take me again. My voice was thick with fear, my words tumbling out like a broken record until exhaustion overtook me. When I finally quieted, they carefully changed my pajamas and tucked me back into bed. The next morning, my mom asked if I'd had a dream about aliens. I stared at her blankly, had no idea what she was talking about. There was no memory of the closet, the tears, or the fear. She gently pressed on, asking if I ever worried about being taken by aliens, and I assured her that I didn't. To me, it seemed like an odd and unsettling story, but not something that stirred any fear in my waking hours. My parents never made a big deal about it, choosing instead to quietly monitor me for any similar incidents. For their part, they were relieved it never happened again. But for me, though I didn't consciously remember the event, I carried a quiet sense of unease in the back of my mind. A question lingered. If I didn't remember that night, what else might I not remember? As I grew older, that night faded into a foggy curiosity, something I couldn't fully grasp, but couldn't quite let go of either. I wondered whether it had been an ordinary nightmare or something more. Sometimes, late at night, I would stare into the dark corners of my room and wonder if something had once been there, watching me, waiting. The thought would make me pull my covers a little tighter around my shoulders and squeeze my eyes shut, hoping for the comfort of sleep. To this day, my mother remembers that night vividly. She says there was something different about it, something in the way I cried, the desperation in my voice, the way I fought my father as though my life depended on it. She wonders, even now, if there was more to my fear than a child's dream. I've never asked her if she believes I was taken. Part of me doesn't want to know her answer. All these years later, I still have no memory of that night, but sometimes in the stillness between waking and sleep, a fleeting image flashes across my mind. Dim light, a tall figure, an overwhelming sense of paralysis slips away before I can catch it, leaving only a cold, hollow feeling in my chest. I tell myself it's probably nothing, just the brain conjuring stories from old fears. But deep down, a part of me still wonders, what if the aliens really did come for me that night? Story 3. The man at the shopping center. Nearly 2 years ago, my husband and I decided to embrace a little adventure. We moved into a vibrant apartment perched above a bustling shopping center in what felt like one of the safest towns we could imagine. The streets below were alive with cozy restaurants, boutique shops, the theater that often filled the air with faint music and laughter. At night, the warm lights from the storefronts spilled upward, casting a golden glow against our windows. We loved living there. It felt like being in the heart of everything, young and free, enjoying the gentle chaos of life before starting a family. Since moving in, I developed a habit of taking long walks through the center, weaving past the rows of cafes and shops. I'd walk almost every other day. Sometimes in the early morning when the world was quiet, sometimes in the evening when people hurried about their lives. The air was always alive with voices and the soft hum of activity, which gave me a sense of comfort. Over time, I came to recognize certain faces, other walkers, shopkeepers, and even the regulars who always seemed to occupy the same benches. But there was one man I noticed often, sitting alone on a bench near the fountain. He was older, with a tired expression and a posture that seemed heavy with years. Every time I passed, an uneasy feeling would stir in my chest. Something about him felt off. He never said a word, never even acknowledged me, yet his presence lingered in my mind like a shadow. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that I was being judgmental. Maybe he was just a lonely man looking for the company of people moving around him. Maybe my discomfort was nothing more than paranoia. I kept my distance, diverting my path when I saw him ahead. Each time I did, guilt tugged at me. You're imagining things, I thought. He's harmless. He's probably someone's grandfather, just wanting to feel the energy of others around him. And so I forced myself to dismiss the unease, to keep my walks uninterrupted. After all, nothing bad had ever happened in this charming little place. Then, one night, everything changed. I wasn't there when it happened. It was around 8 in the evening, a time I never walked alone. The next morning, the local news reported a horrifying story. A woman had been kidnapped at gunpoint right there in the shopping center. The details chilled me. The man had forced her into a car, assaulted her, and tried to drive away with her as his captive. Her husband, who had been nearby, chased after them and even fired his weapon in a desperate attempt to save her. By some miracle, she was rescued. The man was arrested shortly afterward. And then came the detail that turned my stomach to ice. The kidnapper was described as an older man. He had been stalking the shopping center for months, watching women, waiting for the right moment to strike. He admitted to police that he had come there repeatedly, lurking for victims. I felt my breath catch as I realized how many times I had seen him, how many times I had crossed his path, how often I had walked within arm's reach of this man, feeling that quiet alarm ringing in my mind, and how many times I had silenced it with guilt, convincing myself that I was overreacting. Since then, I can't stop replaying every encounter in my mind. Every moment I felt his eyes on me. Every time I felt the urge to turn around and check if he was following. I think about how easily I could have been in that woman's place, how close I came without even realizing it. The lesson was burned deep into me. Trust your instincts. That little voice in your head that whispers warnings. It's there for a reason. Now, when I go on my walks, I stay aware of my surroundings. I don't hesitate to listen to my gut. It's not about fear, it's about caution. Because sometimes, the bad things you think only happen far away can be waiting quietly in the places that feel the safest. Story 4. The fog at the cabin, living in northern Canada, has always meant accepting the raw beauty and quiet dangers of the wilderness. I've grown used to the snowstorms, the stillness of the forests, and the kind of silence that can make you feel like the only person left in the world. It's both comforting and unsettling at times. Last weekend, however, I encountered something that reminded me how fragile our sense of safety can be out here. It began with a phone call from a friend. He had been on a ski trip and decided to swing by my cabin as it was along his route. What he saw alarmed him enough to call me immediately. He told me the windows were smashed, and it looked like someone had broken in. The news left me both stunned and anxious. That cabin had been my retreat, my sanctuary from the world. Thought of it, violated, felt deeply personal. I hurried out to my shed, gathering tarps, boards, hand tools to repair the damage, at least enough to keep the snow from piling inside. As I loaded my sled, a sharp unease settled in my chest. Something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. On impulse, I reached for my rifle. It's better safe than sorry, I told myself. The ride into the woods started off normal, but soon the sky began to darken in an unnatural way. I muttered to myself, annoyed at the thought of an incoming storm. But as the darkness thickened, I realized it wasn't snow clouds. It was fog, a dense, heavy fog that rolled in so quickly it seemed alive. Visibility dropped to mere feet, and the silence of the forest became oppressive. Every sound seemed swallowed up in the grayness, and my sense of direction faltered. By the time I reached the cabin, my pulse was racing. The damage was exactly as my friend described. Shattered windows, glass scattered like ice across the porch. I worked quickly, securing boards over the openings, eager to finish and leave before the fog thickened further. But as I hammered the last board in place, a chilling sensation swept over me, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I froze, my breath cloudy in the cold air, and strained my ears. There it was. The faint sound of movement, branches cracking softly, footsteps muffled by the fog. My heart pounded as I lifted my rifle and pressed my back against the cabin wall. I scanned the white haze, but the shapes of the trees melted into the fog, leaving me blind. My first thought was that the person who broke into my cabin had returned, using the fog as cover. But the forest remained eerily still after those initial sounds. No voices, no snowmobiles, just silence. Slowly, I convinced myself it was an animal and resumed my work, though my hands trembled as I packed up my tools. The ride back was tense, my eyes darting to every shadow, every movement in the gray curtain surrounding me. Then I noticed tracks on the trail ahead, large, deep impressions in the snow. My stomach dropped as I realized what they were, polar bear tracks, and they were leading directly toward my cabin. It dawned on me then, the sound I'd heard, the eerie sense of being watched, It hadn't been a person. It was a polar bear, likely the one that had smashed my windows in search of food. In that fog, I would never have seen it coming, and my rifle. It would have been little more than a stick against such a massive predator. Even now, the memory of that day makes my skin crawl. The wilderness is beautiful, but it doesn't care about you. It reminds you, in its quiet and powerful way, that you're not the apex predator here. That day, I was lucky. Next time, I might not be. Story 5. The heavy darkness in the car. I've always loved the quiet of driving at night. There's something soothing about empty roads and the soft glow of streetlights passing overhead. So, when I started working for DoorDash, I found myself naturally drawn to late-night shifts. The streets were calm, the air cool, and the only sound was the gentle hum of my car's engine. My wife, however, hated it. She warned me constantly about driving into the bad parts of town after midnight. But I didn't see it that way. For months, I had driven without fear, navigating the west side, the south side, and downtown without so much as an unsettling moment. That is, until tonight. My shift began at 5 p.m. As usual, the dinner rush was slow, so I spent a lot of time parked, waiting for orders. Around 6 p.m., I began to feel oddly restless. My legs wouldn't stay still, and my chest carried an energy that made me want to run. It was a strange, nervous energy I couldn't shake. I parked at a gas station, walked around for a few minutes, and bought a soda to calm my nerves. For a while, it worked. By 7 p.m., I was driving on the west side, feeling normal again. Business picked up, and I focused on my deliveries. But then, small mistakes began to creep in. I missed turns I knew by heart, drove too slowly on empty streets, and even stopped at a green light for no reason. It felt like my mind was slipping somehow. By 8 p.m., I shifted to the south side. The sun had set completely, but tonight's darkness felt different. It wasn't the usual calm of night. It was heavier, thicker, as if it carried weight. A subtle anxiety crawled under my skin. My legs became restless again, the same way they had earlier. As I continued working, I noticed the darkness pressing in around me like a physical presence. When I picked up food for one order, I felt it, a deep, vibrating sensation that seemed to hum through my body. It wasn't a sound, not exactly, but something lower than hearing, like a frequency my bones could feel. My heart thudded heavily in my chest, and for a moment I thought I could hear it pounding in my ears. At 9 p.m., I accepted an order that took me to a familiar neighborhood. I had been there dozens of times before, but tonight it felt alien. As I pulled up to the house, dread hit me like a wave. Not ordinary fear, but absolute, soul-deep dread. I felt as if something was watching me. No, staring straight into me. The thought formed unbidden. There's someone in the back seat. My body went cold, and tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. Every instinct screamed at me not to turn around, but eventually I forced myself to look. The back seat was empty. It's darkness. Yet the darkness felt wrong. It seemed denser than it should have been, almost solid, like a presence coiled in the shadows. I got out of the car to shake the feeling. A second car pulled into the driveway as I approached the house, and I hoped to hand the food to them, but they sat in their vehicle, staring down at the glow of their phone. 3 times they glanced at me before I gathered the courage to walk to the door, drop off the food, and take the photo for proof of delivery. Every step felt harder than the last, as if the air itself resisted my movement. When I returned to my car, the person in the driveway was still watching. I climbed in, locking the doors. The cabin light faded slowly, and as the darkness enveloped me again, it felt even heavier, like invisible figures were sitting behind me, breathing down my neck. My pulse raced. I turned the key and drove away, gripping the wheel tight. I ended my shift early at 9:30, sobbing as I drove home with the inside lights on. By the time I stepped through the door, I felt hollow. My wife asked why I was home so soon, and I couldn't find the words to explain. Even now, hours later, I sit on the couch with every light in the house blazing, unable to go outside. It feels like something followed me home. The darkness still clings to me, heavy and suffocating, and I can't shake the fear that it's waiting, just out of sight. Story 6. The Black Silhouette in the Fields. It was the summer of 2014 in a quiet provincial town in Ecuador. My father owned a small livestock farm, and every weekend after school let out, I'd help him with chores. Most of my tasks were simple: feeding the cows, checking the fences, and making sure none of the animals had wandered off. That Saturday started like any other. I saddled up my horse Loco and headed out for a routine batch check around 3 in the afternoon. I remember thinking how beautiful the day was: warm sun, a soft breeze, and the scent of grass heavy in the air, because the farm's pasture was limited. We rented land nearby to graze some of the cattle. It was a bit of a trek, about 50 minutes on horseback, but I didn't mind. The ride always gave me time to clear my head. Everything about that afternoon seemed ordinary. I rode the route I knew so well, checked on the cows, and found no issues. By 5:30 p.m., I turned Loco back toward home, eager to make it back before the sky darkened. That's when things began to change. About halfway home, an unsettling sensation swept over me like a cold wind. It wasn't the physical chill of the air, but something deeper, a primal sense that something was wrong. The hair on my arms stood on end. I tightened my grip on Loco's reins, trying to dismiss the feeling as nerves, but Loco wasn't having it. My calm, noble horse suddenly began fighting me, tossing his head and flicking his ears wildly as if something unseen was approaching. His movements grew frantic. His hooves dug at the earth, and his muscles trembled beneath me. It took all my strength to keep him from bolting. Confused, I scanned the area. That's when my eyes caught it, a black silhouette standing near the fence line. No more than 1.5 meters tall, it had no distinct features, no face, no clothing. It was just there. In the blink of an eye, the shadow vanished. It didn't run or fade like smoke. It simply disappeared into the underbrush, as though it had never existed. Yet the grass and dry branches along the fence trembled violently, as if something enormous had moved through them. My heart pounded. This wasn't an animal. Teed didn't make any of the usual sounds a creature would make, didn't even disturb the air in a way that felt natural. At that moment, Loco reared back, his strength breaking through my control. My hands burned from gripping the reins so tightly, and then nothing. My fingers went completely numb, as if all energy had drained from them. Loco bolted, and all I could do was cling to his mane with what little strength remained, praying I wouldn't fall and break my neck. We rode like that for what felt like an eternity before he finally slowed. I slid off his back, trembling, and led him to a nearby stream for water. As I bent to splash some on my face, an intense burning erupted in my eyes. It was a pain so sharp it felt like someone had poured pepper spray directly into them. Splinking through tears, I stumbled to my feet. By the time we made it home, my mother gasped at the sight of me. "What's wrong with your eyes?" she asked, her voice shaking. I brushed it off, saying it was probably sweat or dust, but she insisted I check a mirror. What I saw made my stomach twist. The whites of my eyes were gone, replaced entirely with a deep, vivid red. It was as though my eyes were weeping blood. The redness lasted for 2 whole months. Doctors couldn't explain it. They found no infection, no trauma, nothing. And in all that time, I couldn't shake the memory of that black silhouette. 8 years have passed since then, but I still avoid that area of the pasture. Loco, my faithful companion on that terrifying day, passed away last year. It pains me to know he's gone, because he was the only other living being who witnessed what I still cannot explain. Story 7. The date on the hiking trail several years ago. I agreed to meet a man I'd been chatting with online. I'd connected on a dating site, and while our conversations were mostly pleasant, there were moments that gave me pause. He seemed serious, too serious. When I tried to lighten the mood with a joke or send a playful message, he never responded with so much as a smiley face or an LOL. Still, I convinced myself that maybe he just wasn't expressive in text. He seemed intelligent and intriguing, and we shared several interests. Against my better judgment, I decided to meet him in person. To be safe, I told one of my best friends all the details before I left: his name, the car he drove, where we planned to meet, and even sent her a screenshot of his online profile. She promised to keep her phone nearby, ready in case I needed her. I felt reassured and told myself I was overthinking. We met at a restaurant near a popular hiking trail. The location struck me as odd, but I brushed it off. Dinner itself was uncomfortable. He didn't laugh at my jokes, didn't even crack a smile. Each time I tried to lighten the conversation, he would stop eating, fix me with an unblinking stare, and let the silence stretch too long. His eyes had a cold, lifeless quality, like a doll's eyes, empty and unsettling. Then he began to talk about his job. His words grew sharper as he spoke about colleagues he believed didn't appreciate his intelligence. He described how he deserved more respect, how he was smarter than everyone around him. Red flags flashed in my mind, one after another. His voice was calm, too calm, but underneath it was something dangerous, an anger simmering just beneath the surface. After we finished eating, he suggested we take a walk on the hiking trail. I hesitated, but didn't want to seem rude. I excused myself to use the restroom and called my friend, explaining everything in a hurried whisper. She could hear the panic in my voice and promised to call me with a made-up emergency to get me out of there. When I returned, he was waiting by the trail entrance. There were still people walking nearby, which made me feel safer, so I agreed to follow him. But as we walked deeper, he started suggesting we veer off the main path. He told me he'd discovered a great spot earlier and wanted to show it to me. The pit in my stomach grew heavier with every step. I texted my friend an SOS. Minutes later, she called with a frantic story about her car breaking down and needing me to come help immediately. I pretended to be alarmed and told him I had to leave. He didn't buy it. His expression shifted for the first time, a flicker of frustration and something darker passing over his face. He insisted on coming with me to meet her, saying it was dangerous for me to go alone. I refused firmly and started walking back toward the trailhead where others could see us. As I got closer to the crowded area, his anger seemed to dissolve, replaced by that same cold blankness I had seen during dinner. He stayed behind, watching me leave without saying a word. Even now, I don't know for certain if he planned to harm me, but everything in my body screamed danger. I've replayed the moments over and over in my head, wondering what might have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts. That day taught me that it's better to risk seeming rude than to ignore that deep, primal warning your body gives you. Some part of me still wonders what was waiting in that great spot he wanted to show me, but I don't ever want to find out. Story 8. The Room in the Basement. When I was 14, my parents bought an old house in a quiet rural town. It had the kind of charm they loved: creaky wooden floors, antique fixtures, and wide windows that looked out over fields of swaying grass. But for me, the house always carried a faint unease. The air felt heavy, especially in the evenings, and sometimes I'd catch myself holding my breath without knowing why. The basement, in particular, filled me with dread. It wasn't the usual childhood fear of dark spaces. I loved exploring basements and attics, searching for forgotten treasures in cardboard boxes. But this basement was different. It was colder than the rest of the house, even in summer. The concrete walls seemed to sweat moisture that smelled faintly of earth and rust. At the far end of the basement was a door. It was plain and wooden, with no handle, just a keyhole. My father told me it led to an old storage room the previous owners had nailed shut. Probably nothing but dust and spiders in there, he said, laughing when he caught me staring at it. But sometimes, when I went down to do laundry, I thought I heard faint noises from behind the door, a soft scratching like fingernails on wood. One evening, curiosity overcame my fear. While my parents were out, I brought a hammer and a flashlight downstairs. My heart raced as I pried at the nails sealing the door shut. With each one that came loose, the air grew colder, heavy, like a storm was building in the walls. When I finally pulled the door open, I was hit with the smell of damp earth and decay. Inside was a small, windowless room. The floor was covered in dirt, and the walls bore strange markings. Symbols I didn't recognize, drawn in what looked like chalk or ash. In the center of the room was a chair. It was old and splintered, but what made my stomach turn was the heavy leather straps attached to its arms and legs. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The air felt wrong, charged with something I couldn't name. Then I heard it, a faint exhale, like someone breathing just behind me. I spun around, but the basement was empty. No footsteps, no shadows, just silence and the sound of my own rapid breathing. Panic clawed at me, and I stumbled backward out of the small room, slamming the door shut. I shoved the nails back in as best I could, my fingers clumsy with fear. As I pounded the last nail in, I swore I heard a soft whisper from inside. I didn't stay to listen. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house sent shivers down my spine. When my parents came home, I didn't tell them what I had done, okay? I didn't want to explain the symbols, the chair, or the suffocating feeling that still clung to me. But from then on, I avoided the basement altogether. Years later, long after we'd moved, I sometimes dream of that room. In the dreams, the door swings open on its own, and I see the chair bathed in a dim, flickering light. And just before I wake up, I hear that whisper again, closer this time, as though whatever was in that room has been waiting all along for me to return. Story 9. The wrong turn in the woods when I was 17. My best friend and I often explored the wooded trails behind my grandparents' house. The forest stretched for miles, its winding paths perfect for long walks and quiet conversations. In the daylight, it was serene, sunlight filtering through the leaves, birdsong carried on the wind. But at night, it transformed into something else entirely. The shadows deepened, and even the gentle rustle of leaves seemed louder, sharper. One Saturday evening in late autumn, we set out later than usual, as the air was cool, the sun already dipping below the horizon as we followed a familiar trail. We told ourselves we'd only be out for a little while, long enough to enjoy the crisp air and the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot. Neither of us thought to bring a flashlight. At first, everything felt normal. We laughed and joked, breathing in the earthy scent of the forest. But as the light faded, an uneasy quiet settled over the woods. The laughter died on our lips, replaced by a shared sense of tension neither of us wanted to acknowledge. It felt as though the trees themselves were leaning closer, their bare branches like skeletal fingers reaching for us. After a while, we realized the trail had disappeared beneath our feet. Somehow, without noticing, we'd strayed from the path. I tried to stay calm as we retraced our steps, scanning the ground for familiar markers. But no matter which direction we chose, everything looked the same, an endless sea of gray trunks and tangled undergrowth. That's when we heard it. Faint footsteps, crunching leaves in the distance. At first, we thought it might be another hiker. But when we called out, the sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was heavier than before, pressing down on us like a physical weight. We quickened our pace, but the footsteps resumed, this time closer. It felt like whoever, or whatever it was, had been waiting for us to move, mimicking our rhythm perfectly. When we stopped, it stopped. When we walked, it followed. The hair on my arms stood on end, and a cold dread settled deep in my stomach. We broke into a run, branches clawing at our jackets as we stumbled blindly through the dark. Behind us, the sound of pursuit grew louder, faster. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might burst. Then, out of nowhere, we burst into a small clearing, bathed in pale moonlight. The sound stopped. In the center of the clearing was an old stone well, covered in moss and cracked with age. For a moment, we stood frozen, gasping for breath, unsure if we were safe. Then, from the shadows beyond the trees, we saw movement, a tall, thin figure standing perfectly still. We couldn't see its face, but its presence radiated something deeply wrong, something that sent us sprinting in the opposite direction. By some miracle, we stumbled onto a familiar trail and followed it back to my grandparents' house, not daring to look behind us. When we finally burst through the back door, our lungs burning, my grandmother looked up from her knitting with a knowing expression. "You kids went too far," she said softly. "There are places in those woods you're not meant to find." We never spoke about what happened that night, not to each other, not to anyone else. Ma, but I've never set foot in those woods again. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I can hear those footsteps outside my window, waiting for me to take another wrong turn. Story 10. The face in the window when I was 8 years old. My parents moved us into a modest house at the edge of a small town. It wasn't anything fancy, just 3 bedrooms, a creaky wooden porch, and a big backyard that melted into a thick wall of trees. To my young eyes, it felt like a dream. There was so much room to run, and the forest felt like my own secret kingdom. But as the weeks passed, I started noticing little things that unsettled me. At night, the house seemed to breathe. The walls groaned softly, and the wind whispered through the old windows in voices too low to understand. My parents brushed it off as the house settling, but it never felt that way to me. It felt like something alive was watching us, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. One evening, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard a faint tapping sound. It was slow and deliberate, like fingernails against glass. At first, I thought it was the branches outside, but then I realized it was coming from my window. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor, too high for anyone or anything to reach easily. I froze, my small body stiff with fear. Slowly, I turned my head toward the sound, and that's when I saw it. A pale face pressed against the glass, its features obscured by the darkness. The eyes were wide, almost too wide, and fixed directly on me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The face didn't move, It just stared, as if studying me, waiting for me to blink or turn away. I pulled the covers over my head, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break my ribs. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, listening to the tap, 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 until eventually silence settled in. Exhaustion finally dragged me into sleep. The next morning, I told my parents about the face in the window. They exchanged concerned glances, but insisted it was just a dream. "You've been reading too many scary books," my mom said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But that night, my dad nailed the window shut from the inside. Weeks passed without incident, and I began to convince myself they were right. Maybe it had been a nightmare. But then, one night, as I was brushing my teeth, I caught movement in the reflection of the bathroom mirror. Behind me, in the small square window above the sink, I saw it again, the same pale face, staring silently. I spun around, but the window was empty. My parents found me curled up on the bathroom floor, sobbing uncontrollably. After that night, they moved me into the bedroom farthest from the backyard. We never spoke of it again. We moved out of that house a year later. The new owners tore it down to build something bigger and more modern. But sometimes I wonder if they ever saw it too. That pale face, those wide, unblinking eyes watching from the dark. Now, as an adult, I live far from that town, but every so often when I'm alone in my own home and the wind rattles the windows. I swear I hear that faint, deliberate tapping again. Story 11. The Stranger on the Bus. It was late winter when I moved to the city for a new job. I didn't own a car, so I relied on public transportation to get around. Most nights after work, I'd catch the same bus home, a quiet ride through dimly lit streets that felt almost comforting. The bus was rarely crowded, and I'd spend those rides staring out the window at the blur of passing lights. A man in a dark hoodie, sitting 3 rows ahead, his face obscured by the shadows. He wasn't looking out the window or scrolling through his phone like the others. He was sitting perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, as though listening intently. Each time the bus stopped to let someone on or off, he didn't move. Even when other passengers shifted seats or gathered their belongings, he remained frozen, his posture rigid. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that he was just tired or deep in thought. But the longer I watched, the more convinced I became that he was aware of me. At one point, he turned his head just slightly, and I caught the faint gleam of eyes in the dim light. They weren't focused on the window or the aisle. They were looking straight at me. My stomach knotted, and I quickly looked away, pretending to scroll through my phone. But out of the corner of my eye, I could still feel his gaze. 2 stops before mine, most of the other passengers got off. Now it was just me, the driver, and the man in the hoodie. The bus felt cavernous and silent, each creak of its frame amplified in the stillness. I considered getting off early and walking the rest of the way home, but the streets outside were deserted and poorly lit. I stayed put, hoping he would leave first. As we neared my stop, I pulled the cord, the ding cutting sharply through the silence. The door hissed shut behind me, but I didn't hear the bus pull away. Instead, I heard footsteps on the pavement. I glanced back. The man in the hoodie had stepped off the bus too. He didn't say anything. He didn't call out. He just followed, matching my pace as I quickened my steps. My house was still 2 blocks away, but I couldn't bring myself to head straight there. Instead, I turned sharply down a side street and ducked into the bright glow of a 24-hour laundromat. Inside, the attendant looked up in surprise as I stumbled in, trying to act casual while my heart raced. Through the glass door, I watched as the man walked past, his head still tilted slightly as though listening for something. He didn't stop, didn't turn his head. He just kept walking until he disappeared into the darkness. I waited in the laundromat for nearly an hour before finally making my way home. Now, whenever I ride the bus, I choose seats near the driver and keep my eyes on the aisle. And though I've never seen the man again, I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't turned down that side street. Story 12. The Midnight Call. It was nearly 2 a.m. when my phone rang, startling me out of a light sleep. Groggily reached for it, wondering who would be calling at such an hour. The screen displayed an unknown number. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but something in my chest told me to answer. Hello? My voice was hoarse, heavy with sleep. There was silence on the other end, No static, no breathing, just a hollow emptiness that made my skin crawl. I was about to hang up when a voice finally spoke. It was soft, almost childlike, but carried a strange echo as though coming from a deep tunnel. "You shouldn't be alone." A chill ran down my spine. "Who is this?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer, just a faint rustling sound, like paper crumpling, followed by a whisper so faint I had to strain to hear it. "They're coming." The line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, my heart pounding. Maybe it was a prank. Someone bored and looking for reactions in the middle of the night. I set the phone down and tried to shake off the unease. But as I lay back down, I noticed something strange. My apartment, which had been filled with the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old pipes, had gone completely silent. The air felt thicker somehow, heavy and unmoving. I sat up in bed, listening intently, and that's when I heard it. A soft, shuffling sound coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. My breath caught. I hadn't heard the front door open. No one else should be in the apartment. Slowly, I reached for the baseball bat I kept under the bed, gripping it tightly as I slid out from under the covers. The shuffling stopped. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. From just beyond the bedroom door, a soft knock. Not forceful, not loud, just a gentle tap tap tap, like knuckles brushing wood. I stood frozen, heart hammering in my ears. Whoever or whatever was out there hadn't tried to open the door. They were waiting, listening. The phone on my nightstand vibrated suddenly, the screen lighting up with the same unknown number. I didn't answer. Instead, I backed toward the window, fumbling with the lock. If I needed to, I could climb down the fire escape and call for help from a neighbor's place. But before I could open it, the phone stopped buzzing. Silence returned, thick and suffocating. Then the voice came again, not from the phone this time, but from the hallway itself, slow and distant, yet somehow right outside the door. "You shouldn't be alone." I never found out what was on the other side of that door. I spent the rest of the night on the fire escape, gripping my bat and staring at my darkened apartment through the glass. When the sun finally rose, I worked up the courage to go back inside. Everything looked normal. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no phone calls in my call history. But some nights, when I lie in bed with the lights off, I swear I can still hear that faint tapped and the soft voice whispering in the dark. Story 13. The Cabin on the Lake. A few years ago, I rented a small cabin on a secluded lake for a weekend getaway. I was burnt out from work and needed space to think, to breathe. The cabin was charming in its own way. Wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace, and large windows that overlooked the still, glassy water. There was no cell service out there, which at first felt freeing. Just me, nature, and the gentle lap of waves against the dock. The first night was peaceful as I sat on the porch with a book and a glass of wine, listening to the soft calls of loons in the distance. The moon hung low over the lake, casting a pale reflection across the water. By midnight, I crawled into bed and drifted into one of the deepest sleeps I'd had in months. But the second night was different. It started with a sound, a faint splash, as though something or someone had stepped into the water. I sat up in bed, the cabin wrapped in thick silence, except for the gentle creak of its old wooden frame. Another splash followed, closer this time. My mind raced. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer, perhaps, coming to drink from the lake. Curiosity tugged at me. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept toward the window. The beam of light cut across the dark water, and for a moment I saw nothing but gentle ripples. Then, just beyond the reach of the light, I thought I saw movement, a pale shape, too large to be a fish, floating just below the surface. My stomach twisted. I turned off the flashlight and backed away from the window, convincing myself it was driftwood or my eyes playing tricks. But then came the knock. It was soft, 3 gentle raps against the front door. My breath caught in my throat. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and no one knew I was here. I froze, listening as the knock came again, louder this time. "Who's there?" My voice was shaky, barely more than a whisper. No response. Just silence, so deep it seemed to press in on me from all sides. Then I heard it, a low, gurgling sound like water being sucked down a drain. I didn't dare move. My heart pounded in my ears as the sound grew fainter, retreating toward the lake. When I finally worked up the courage to peek out the window again, the shoreline was empty. Nothing moved. The water was still once more, its surface smooth and unbroken. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the center of the cabin, clutching the flashlight with trembling hands, waiting for the sun to rise. The moment daylight broke, I packed my bag and left without looking back. Even now, years later, I sometimes dream of that lake. In the dreams, I see pale fingers reaching up from the water, tapping gently on glass, waiting for me to open the door. Story 14. The Man Behind the Curtain. When I was in college, I rented a small, 1-bedroom apartment on the top floor of an old building. It was nothing fancy, creaky floors, peeling paint, and a single window that overlooked a narrow alley. But it was affordable, and it felt like my own little sanctuary. I loved coming home after long days of lectures, throwing my bag down and curling up with a book in the warm glow of my desk lamp. One night, after a late study session at the library, I returned home just past midnight. The building was unusually quiet as I climbed the stairs. Even the usual sounds of creaking pipes and muffled televisions seemed absent. Unlocking my door, I stepped inside and was immediately struck by the stillness. Something felt wrong. I shook it off as exhaustion and went about my routine, setting my keys on the counter and pouring myself a glass of water. Okay? As I moved toward the bedroom, my eyes drifted to the window. The thin curtains swayed gently as if touched by a breeze, but the window was closed. I frowned, feeling a twinge of unease. That's when I noticed it. A faint outline in the space behind the curtain. It was subtle, barely noticeable in the dim light, but once I saw it, I couldn't look away. The shape was tall, too tall to be a coat rack or any furniture I owned. My heart thudded in my chest as I realized the figure wasn't moving at all. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to stay quiet. Slowly, I backed toward the door, my keys still in my hand. The thought of turning my back on that figure made my skin crawl. Just as I reached the doorknob, the curtain shifted ever so slightly, as though something or someone had brushed against it. Summoning every ounce of courage, I threw the door open and bolted down the stairs, 2 at a time. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the streetlights outside. My hands trembled as I called the police, explaining in a whisper what I had seen. When they arrived, they searched the apartment thoroughly. There was no one there. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing to suggest anyone had been inside. The officers assured me it was probably my imagination, the result of stress and lack of sleep. But when they pulled the curtain aside, they found smudges, long, faint streaks on the glass, as though fingers had been pressed against it from the inside. I didn't stay in that apartment much longer. I packed my belongings the next morning and crashed on a friend's couch until I could find somewhere else to live. Hey, even now, years later, I still dream of that night. In the dream, the curtain pulls back slowly, and a pale face peers out at me with hollow eyes. Story 15. The Thing in the Mirror. When I was a kid, my grandmother had an old house full of strange antiques. The one that always caught my attention was the tall, ornate mirror that stood in her hallway. It had a gold frame carved with twisting vines and flowers, and its surface seemed almost too perfect, so clear it felt like you could fall into it. She used to warn me not to stare into it for too long. Mirrors are tricky things, she'd say with a soft smile. They show more than you think. At the time, I thought she was just being her usual, whimsical self. But there was something about that mirror that unsettled me. When I walked past it, I'd catch glimpses of movement that didn't match my own, tiny delays or odd angles, as if the reflection was slightly out of sync. One night, I stayed over at her house while my parents were away. The guest room was just across from the hallway mirror. As I lay in bed, the dim moonlight spilling through the window, I found my eyes drifting toward it. Even in the dark, the gold frame seemed to shimmer faintly. Then I saw it, a shape in the mirror that wasn't mine. It was faint at first, a smudge in the glass, like fog, but as I stared, it sharpened. A tall, thin figure stood behind my reflection, its face obscured in shadow. My blood turned cold. I knew no one else was in the house. My grandmother had gone to bed hours ago. I squeezed my eyes shut, telling myself it was my imagination, some trick of the light. But when I opened them again, the figure was closer, its head tilted slightly, as though it was studying me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. Then the figure raised its hand, slowly, deliberately, and pressed its palm against the inside of the glass. The sound was muffled, but I swear I heard a faint tap, 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 echoing from the hallway. Summoning every ounce of strength, I lunged out of bed and flipped on the light. The mirror showed nothing now but my pale, terrified face and the empty hallway behind me. Still, I dragged a blanket over the frame, hiding it from view. The next morning, my grandmother noticed the blanket and gave me a knowing look. "It's better that way," she said softly. "Some things on the other side, they notice when you look too long." I never asked her what she meant, but even now, as an adult, I can't stand to have mirrors in my bedroom. Late at night, when I catch my reflection in the bathroom, I sometimes think I see movement behind me, and I have to remind myself not to look too long. Story 16. The Knock in the Middle of Nowhere. A few years ago, I took a solo road trip across the country. It was something I'd always wanted to do, to drive for hours on end with nothing but the open road, my favorite playlists, and the kind of quiet you can only find far away from cities. One night, while crossing through a stretch of remote desert, I pulled off onto a small dirt road to sleep in my car. It was a warm evening, and the stars above me were breathtaking. The area was completely empty. No cars, no lights, not even the faint hum of power lines. It felt like I had stepped out of the world and into some liminal space where time slowed down. I parked near a cluster of low shrubs, rolled down the windows to let in a breeze, and reclined my seat. The silence was so deep, it felt like a sound in itself. At first, I felt perfectly at ease, but as the hours passed, a faint unease crept in. The desert silence was oppressive. There were no chirping insects, no rustle of wind, just stillness. I tried to shrug it off and close my eyes, determined to get some rest before the next day's drive. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a sound, a single, sharp knock on the driver's side window. My heart leapt into my throat. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, but then it came again, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I froze, staring at the shadowy outline of the window. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. The closest town was at least 50 miles away. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. The knocking stopped, replaced by a faint shuffling sound as though someone or something was circling the car. Suddenly, a low voice murmured from outside. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was soft, almost coaxing, like someone trying to lure a frightened animal. Then I heard it again, clearer this time. "Come out." My blood ran cold. Slowly, I reached for the car keys, careful not to make a sound. I jammed them into the ignition, praying the engine wouldn't stall. The voice came again, now on the other side of the car. "Come out, just for a moment." I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. Without looking back, I slammed the car into drive and sped down the dirt road, my tires spitting up clouds of dust. In my rearview mirror, I thought I saw a tall figure standing in the glow of my taillights. Its features were lost to the darkness, but it didn't move as I disappeared into the night. I didn't stop driving until I reached a well-lit gas station hours later. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, and my mind kept replaying the sound of those slow, deliberate knocks. Now, whenever I take long trips, I refuse to sleep in my car, and I never, ever stop in the middle of nowhere after dark.